All right, let me get rid of this here, the participants window, so it's not blocking people. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. My name is Katja Sippel, and I'm the Executive Director of the German American Heritage Foundation and Museum. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening, and it's a particular pleasure to have Mr. Don Smith here. Oh, and I see we're getting another attendee here, another viewer. So forgive me if I interrupt to allow people to join the presentation. Don, it's wonderful to have you with us tonight, and we do apologize for making this Zoom only. Initially, we thought that there might be unrest regarding or surrounding the election. Fortunately, that did not happen. But it turned out to be rather fortuitous as I came down with COVID. As you can see and hear, I'm quite all right, but I am worried about being somewhat contagious. And of course, I don't want to spread the virus. It's one thing to spread joy, quite another to spread the COVID virus. So it's a good thing that I'm here in the confines of my own house where I cannot infect anybody else. Don, pleasure to have you with us tonight. As I said before, I've often been asked why we don't do more things about the Cold War. Well, 2024 has been the year of the Cold War, actually, for us at the German American Heritage Museum. We've done an exhibit on the Berlin airlift, the 75th anniversary. We've done a presentation with Gary Powers Jr., the son of the U-2 pilot. We've done an exhibit on Yoichi Okamoto about Cold War era Vienna. And now we have Don Smith here tonight, who's going to talk about Steinstuecken, a little village just outside of Berlin. And Don is a retired Army Reserve officer who was actually in Germany with the Army from 1986 to 1989. So the final years of the Cold War. And he went to Steinstuecken and actually saw the village in person. You visited it, right? More about that later. He has a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Virginia, also my alma mater, so good choice, and a master's degree from the Defense Intelligence Agency's Joint Military Intelligence College, now the National Intelligence University. And he currently teaches geographic information systems for Army personnel at Fort Huachuca in Arizona. And he's been published in Military History Magazine, World War II Magazine, the Civil War Times Magazine, and the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Professional Bulletin. The book on Steinstuecken is his first published book, and signed copies will be available for sale. And Don's going to talk a little more about that later. So Don, I'm handing over to you. Thank you so much. And we all look forward to hearing your presentation. I'm going to mute myself.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. Well, first off, I'd like to thank Katja and the German American Heritage Museum for the opportunity to come and tell you about one of the more unique episodes in America's Cold War history. It's an episode that not many people know about. I've given this presentation several times to people that know quite a bit about Cold War history, and many of them had never heard the experiences of the community of Steinstuecken. Steinstuecken is a neighborhood outside of West Berlin that found itself in a very unique situation during the Cold War. And that created challenges for the people who lived in the community and also for the Americans who were responsible for protecting them. And lots of unique stories came out of that 20-year episode, and something that I wanted to capture in a book. And so hopefully you'll enjoy the presentation tonight. And without further ado, let's get started. All right, so what you're looking at now is a Google Maps snip of the area outside of Berlin, specifically outside the southwest of Berlin. Potsdam is over here to the left side of the screen, and the area that's outlined in red is the community of Steinstuecken. It's a neighborhood, again, right outside the southwest limits of the modern-day city of Berlin. This yellow line here shows you the actual boundaries of the community itself. This looks like a hatchet, but the hatchet blade down here being the community, and then this stem here being the road that connects the community back to the rest of Berlin. You'll see the community is surrounded by the German state of Brandenburg, which surrounds, actually, I believe, all of Berlin, modern day Berlin. Well, this is what the map looked like in 1951. This map was produced by the West Berlin city government. So this hatched line here is the boundary between the American occupation sector of West Berlin to the north and the Soviet occupation zone down here to the south. So you see this hatched line around Steinstuecken. That indicates that it's part of the American sector. Now there's the road that connects Steinstuecken to the rest of Berlin, but you'll notice that there's no hatched line around that road. That's because during the Cold War, all of the territory surrounding the community of Steinstuecken belonged to the state of Brandenburg, which was part of the Soviet occupation zone. So as the old saying goes, a picture tells you 1,000 words. This map here shows you the dilemmas the Americans had. During the height of the Cold War, they were responsible for protecting the community of Steinstuecken without any way to go to it legally by ground. You either send troops or send the West Berlin police to it without risking a confrontation with the Soviets and potentially World War III if one thing led to another. Yet the Americans managed to keep Steinstuecken safe and in Allied hands for more than 20 years. And at the same time, the people in Steinstuecken themselves showed a fair amount of courage in terms of standing up to communist pressure. And that's really the subject of my book. And that's the subject of today's presentation. All right. I'm sure most of us are familiar with this graphic here. This shows how how Germany was divided up into occupation zones after the Cold War. And for some reason, no, actually that's right. I thought for a moment my graphic had gotten reversed, but no, that's fine. The area over here in the red is the Soviet zone. Northwest is the British zone. Down here in the south is the American zone, and over in the southwest is the French zone. And you can see they're broken down into different colors. And there's Berlin. And just a reminder, Berlin itself was under four-power occupation during the Cold War. And so this map here shows the occupation zones in Berlin when the Western Allies arrived in 1945. And so one of the questions I get often is, how did you have this unique situation where you had a portion of the city of Berlin that was physically detached from the rest of the city? And here's how that happened. Well, in early 1944, American, British, and Soviet planners came together and they started planning the occupation of Germany once it had been defeated, once the Nazis had been defeated. And they quickly came to the conclusion that Berlin itself would be under four-power occupation. So they agreed they would divide the city up into four occupation zones. And then the question came up that exactly how do they divide it up? Well, they could have put a piece of tissue paper over a map and drawn some lines, but then somebody pointed out that everyone expected Berlin to be pretty devastated by the time the Allies got there. And it turns out that it was because of bombing and also the Soviet ground attack. And so they knew that there'd be a real challenge in running the city while they were trying to rebuild it. And somebody pointed out that Berlin is actually a series of boroughs. And each borough has its own municipal government. Like New York City is broken down into 5 boroughs: Manhattan, Brooklyn, Staten Island. And each of those boroughs has their own government. And so somebody suggested that instead of just drawing lines on the map and dividing up the city that way, that what they would do is they would allocate certain boroughs to each occupying power. And that way, when one of the occupying powers wanted to get something done within their particular occupation sector, all they had to do was go to the appropriate borough government, give them the orders, and make them carry out the actions. So that's what they did. They decided to allocate specific boroughs to each occupation power. So over here in the East, the Eastern boroughs were given to the Soviets. This is the borough, one of the two boroughs that was given to the French. The British got the Western boroughs here, and the Americans got the Southern boroughs down here: Zehlendorf, Steglitz, Tempelhof, Neukölln, and Kreuzberg. Interestingly, the Americans actually got the best part of the deal when, in terms of dividing up the city, because the boroughs they got tended to be the richest ones in Berlin. They had the nicest housing, and also they tended to be the least damaged. So the Americans actually ended up getting a pretty nice occupation zone. Now, remember I said Steinstuecken was outside of the southwest corner of Berlin. So it's roughly down here where I'm putting the mouse on my map. But you don't see Steinstuecken on the map, do you? Well, the Americans really didn't fully understand that Steinstuecken was part of their zone when they first came into the city in 1945, because they had lots of other things to worry about. Well, this map was created in the fall of 1949, when the Americans were shifting from military to civilian occupation. You see the occupation zones there. There again is the American zone in the hatched lines. And so you don't see Steinstuecken on the map. And that's indicative of the way the Americans really viewed Steinstuecken to the point. It wasn't something that they'd really thought very much about for the first few years of the occupation. Well, that all changed in October 18th, 1951. At this point, the Cold War has started to heat up, and the Soviets are putting pressure on the West Berlin sectors. And so on October 18th, 1951, East German border guards surrounded the neighborhood and posted announcements proclaiming that Steinstuecken was going to be incorporated into the city of Potsdam and incorporated into the land or state of Brandenburg. Now, the reason that was important is that this was a direct challenge by the GDR and undoubtedly their Soviet sponsors to American authority over a portion of the American sector of Berlin. Now, why did the United States care about Steinstuecken? To be honest, it had no strategic or tactical significance to it. There was not a major population center in there. There wasn't a major university or a electricity plant or a water plant or anything. It's what we would consider today to be a bedroom community. It didn't have a grocery store. It didn't have a school. It only had like a small convenience store. So in the big scheme of things, it was insignificant. Now, there were several small sections of detached land around the outskirts of West Berlin throughout the Cold War. Steinstuecken by far was the biggest one. It's the only one that had a actual major population center in it. The others were mostly abandoned fields or vacation cabins. And in 1967, the CIA did a report on those areas, and it said, yes, they're insignificant, but strategically, but the reason they're significant mainly is because they provide the USSR a ready means of testing Western resolve. So in October 1951, the East Germans and the Soviets were testing the American resolve to protect the community of Steinstuecken. Now, some of the things that people were concerned about in Berlin at this time: first, West Berliners were concerned that the United States might focus on other international hotspots. Remember, the Korean War has been going on for about 18 months now. China has now fallen under communist domination. The United States has lots of responsibility elsewhere in the world, and the West Berliners were concerned that maybe they were going to get written off. Maybe they were going to get forgotten. Now, what about the West Germans themselves? There wasn't any real concern on the American side that the West Germans were actually thinking of joining up with the Soviet Union and becoming a communist state. But what the Americans were concerned about is that West Germans were really starting to feel the enforced separation of East and West Germany that had been caused by the USSR split. And West Germans were very concerned about any tensions arising, anything that might cause the Soviet Union to be aggravated, because their concern was that if the Soviet Union was aggravated, they might be less willing to reach some sort of compromise that would enable East and West Germany to come back together. So that was one of the big concerns that the West Germans had, and the Soviets picked up on that. So they started highlighting that in their propaganda. This is a graphic from an East German propaganda magazine, and what it does is it depicts Germany as a divided table. You've got the west part of the table here, you've got the east part of the table here. You see Germans on both sides trying to push the table back together, and of course, it's an East German propaganda, communist propaganda machine. So they've got the stereotypical American soldier in here. They got the stereotypical Nazi, because again, part of the common theme in communist propaganda was that old Nazis had joined up with the Western powers. That's a caricature there of Konrad Adenauer, and the idea being it was those nasty Western forces that were keeping Germany from being reunited. Now, most West Germans didn't believe that, but they did know that their country had been separated, and they were concerned it was going to last for a long time. So many of them were leery about aggravating the Soviet Union for that reason. Now, in late 1951, the US was in a position where it needed the support of West Germany. Now, in the years preceding, when Germany had been a defeated and an occupied power, in many cases, the Americans deliberately treated the German people with a disrespect as a sign of reminding them, enforcing on them the image that they had been defeated in this war. One of the concerns that the Americans had is that we had been too nice to the Germans at the end of World War I, so they really didn't feel defeated. And so there was a real intent on the side of the Americans to make them feel defeated right after the war. And an example of that is a few months after the Americans came into Berlin and started the occupation, the Berlin Philharmonic was allowed to reorganize itself and start doing concerts, on the condition that anytime they did a concert in Berlin, before they played any music, they had to play the national anthems of all four of the occupying powers. So that's kind of the spirit in which we had treated the Germans up until before the Berlin airlift. Well, the Berlin airlift changed a lot of that. But in 1951, the United States was in a position where we literally needed the support of West Germans. That means we needed to treat them differently. And here's some of the reasons we needed the West German support. First, we needed the West German industry and economy, which had started to revive at this point, to help with sustaining NATO and take some of the burden off the U.S. economy, which was paying for the Korean War effort. There was a plan that had been advanced by the French called the Schuman Plan, where there would be an international consortium created that would take control of Germany's steel and coal resources. And the idea behind that was that if there was international control over those resources, then it would be almost impossible for Germany to rearm, create another large army, and start a third world war. Well, the problem is that we needed the Germans to agree to that. And for obvious reasons, the Germans were hesitant about giving up control over some of their most important national industrial and energy resources. So these negotiations were going on in October 1951. And so we wanted to make the Germans willing to agree to that. We also wanted the Germans to agree to integrate their defense, economy, and agriculture with the other nations of Western Europe, because it had become painfully obvious that the individual Western European countries did not have enough arable land or resources to basically to feed themselves and sustain their own economies, because many of the resources and agricultural areas that Europe had relied on were now in the Eastern zone. So those assets were not available to people in the West. And so what the Americans wanted was the Western European countries to integrate their economy, share their resources, and that's the kind of thinking that eventually led to things like the European Common Market and the European Community. Well, at this point, Germany is one of the strongest economic powers on the continent, so we had to get them to agree to do that. lastly, we were trying to figure out some way to technically end the state of war with Germany. Now, the way that you normally end a war with a country you defeated is the victorious powers negotiate a treaty with a defeated country. The problem is that the Soviet Union was one of the victorious powers, and they were not about to negotiate any kind of treaty that the West would be happy with. So instead, the West came up with the idea of something called the contractual agreement, which basically means we would conclude a series of contracts, deals with the West German government, and that would end the state of war and then would enable West Germany, the country West Germany, to re-enter, for lack of a better term, the free world community, and also enable us to station troops long-term in West Germany for its defense. But the Germans had to agree to all that. So we were no longer in a position where we could order the Germans around. We had to get them to agree with us. And so that's one of the reasons that Steinstuecken was really important. Again, it was insignificant, but as I said on a previous slide, it's kind of like a canary in the coal mine. Germans were watching it very closely, and the concern was that if the Americans allowed this community to be abandoned, West Germans might start doubting America as a long-term partner for peace in the region. All right. The gentleman on the left, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. This is Ernst Reuter. He was the mayor of West Berlin during the Berlin blockade, became a hero to the Americans because he rallied the people of West Berlin and West Germany to endure the hardships of the blockade, and that enabled the Americans and the British to create and sustain the airlift that eventually defeated the Berlin blockade. Well, Reuter did not make things easy for the Americans when the Steinstuecken crisis started. He came out and forcefully in public announced that it was a responsibility of the Americans to protect all portions of their occupation sector. And so these are some quotes from Reuter over here on the left. He said, the West Berlin populace is aroused over the unilateral Soviet action. And then in another interview, he said, for the Americans, Steinstuecken is a case of test. So Reuter held our feet to the fire. And the man that was directly felt that heat was this gentleman here. This is Major General Lemuel Matthewson, the U.S. Commandant of Berlin. So what Matthewson did, apparently from what I've been able to determine by my research, he did not plan to send Allied forces into Steinstuecken to recapture it. He couldn't, it didn't look like he had the support of the British and the French garrisons in West Berlin to do that. So apparently what he did was he decided to bluff. He went out to the press and he told them that he expected the Soviets to force the East Germans to respect American occupation rights and release the community of Steinstuecken. And that's exactly what they did. The Soviets blinked. The Soviet commandant came to meet General Matthewson. I describe it in detail in the book, the meeting where they had, where basically they agreed to tell the East Germans police to abandon their control of the village, and which is what they did. Lots of celebration in the city of West Berlin. This is a cartoon that was drawn by the West Berlin political cartoonist Oscar, and it shows Matthewson dressed up in the traditional garb of the German Jaeger, the hunter, with Mama Berlin holding on to baby Steinstuecken, who has just been rescued from the belly of the big bad Soviet wolf. Although technically it should probably be the symbol of the GDR there, because it was GDR troops who were surrounding the village. But the point is, it was a big PR victory for the Americans. Having said that, though, they then de facto had planted their flag in Steinstuecken, so now everyone expected them to keep the village safe. Well, what do you do when you have a village that you're responsible for that you can't send ground troops to or police to? It appears that the Soviet and American occupation authorities, once they had a chance to study the Steinstuecken situation and think about it, they came to an agreement, and I've not seen this written down anywhere, but you just get the general sense by the way that you see the two occupation powers working with each other, is they decided not to let Steinstuecken become a big deal, become something that could spark a confrontation. For example, the Americans did not station a military garrison inside the community. The Soviets kept the East German police under control, and so they didn't try to take over the community. And so from 1951 to 1961, for about a decade, you had a period where there was kind of like an uneasy quiet in the community of Steinstuecken. The people who lived there, they either went to school or worked in West Berlin. So what they would do is they would walk through this woodland path. Most of them didn't have cars, so they walked along this woodland road, and they would go through East German checkpoints going to the city and coming back from the city. And for the most part, they went about their lives. And there was a quiet coexistence between the Americans and the communists. If ever there was a real problem, what would happen with the Steinstuecken residents would then reach out and talk to the American occupation authorities. The American occupation authorities would then reach out and talk to the Soviet occupation authorities, and they would then reach out and talk to the East Germans. Reason the Americans didn't talk directly to these Germans was, as far as we were concerned, there was no such thing as an East German government. Germany was still technically unified. There was just some temporary unpleasantness going on. At some point, there was going to be a peace treaty. And until then, there was no East German government. So if we talked directly to East German officials, that could be taken as US recognition of them. So we didn't do that. So what you're looking at here is a scene where it's mid 1950s, and the main refrigerator in Steinstuecken broke down. Not everybody had a refrigerator at this point. And so the main refrigerator that the convenience store had, where they kept the milk cold for the children and provided cold products, broke down. Well, the East Germans would not allow a West Berlin electrician to come to Steinstuecken to fix the box. So the Steinstueckers complained to the Americans. The Americans complained. It also got some coverage in the West Berlin press, and it got enough pressure that two Soviet officers actually came to Steinstuecken, inspected the refrigerator, and verified that yes, indeed, it was broken. But they still didn't allow an electrician to come in. So then this gentleman here, in the picture on the left-hand side, the bald gentleman with glasses that has a microphone being held up to him, that's the mayor of West Berlin. So he decided to make a PR issue of it. So he announced that he was going to go visit Steinstuecken, brought a whole lot of reporters with him. And in this particular scene on the left, here you see the East German border guards refusing to allow him entrance into Steinstuecken because he's not a resident. And also they didn't officially recognize that village as being part of West Berlin. So what the Steinstueckeners did is they all then came to the border checkpoint to meet him. So here you see citizens of Steinstuecken. This girl lived in Steinstuecken, and she's giving flowers there to the mayor. So incidents like this occurred all throughout this decade, because every so often the East Germans would bar for example, the West Berlin Fire Brigade from coming in to the village. It got to the point they wouldn't allow the postman to come into the village at all. They had to send a citizen of Steinstuecken to go get the mail. And then the Americans and the Soviets would just work it out. But for about 10 years, it was a very quiet life. And lots of people lived in Steinstuecken liked it. One of the residents said that one of the benefits of this whole situation was that the tax collector never showed up. So I'm going to skip to this picture. That all changed when the Berlin Wall crisis started. The GDR Border Patrol police surrounded Steinstuecken with barbed wire. This picture showed up in a lot of the papers in the world. This boy lived in a house that's on the East German side that's right next to Steinstuecken. And the way the story went is that he had been used to playing with kids in Steinstuecken his whole life, but then the barbed wire went up, and now he can't do that anymore. So this picture went out in the press, and it got a lot of coverage, generated a lot of sympathy. But what I was told by some people in Steinstuecken is that this was a relatively smart young lad. He found some holes in the barbed wire and was able to crawl through and continue to play with his friends. And the East German border guards let him do that. Well, about a month after the Berlin Wall went up, President Kennedy sent this man back to Berlin. This is Lucius Clay. This is a picture taken of him when he was the U.S. military governor of Germany during the Berlin airlift crisis. And he became a hero in Berlin because of his determination to keep the city supplied. And Kennedy knew that, and he saw morale dropping in West Berlin after the Berlin Wall crisis. He was concerned that families and businesses would leave the Western sectors and they would become impoverished. So he asked Clay to go and try to find ways to raise the spirits of the people of West Berlin. So he had retired at this point, but he agreed to go as the president's personal representative. And when he gets to Berlin, there's this tumultuous welcome for him. There's like 100,000 people out in the streets. But Clay is smart enough to recognize that the joy is not going to last if he doesn't do something tangible to raise the spirits of the people of Berlin. But at the same time, he can't risk getting into a shooting war with the Soviets and the East Germans. So then somebody told him about the isolated community of Steinstuecken. And so he decided to go visit it. Well, fortunately for him, there was something called the Berlin Control Zone. This is the 75th anniversary of the Berlin airlift. The Soviets abandoned their blockade of West Berlin in May of 1949. And one of the reasons we were able to mount the Berlin airlift is that prior to the airlift, in the first few months of the four-power occupation of Berlin, the four powers had agreed on air traffic zones into the city, and the Soviets had signed off on that, and they respected those air corridors during the Berlin airlift. So in this map you see on the left-hand side, these are the three corridors rather, coming into the city, and those are the corridors we used during the Berlin airlift. You also see this circular area. That was designed to be a place where aircraft of all four of the occupying powers could loiter while they were waiting for a landing slot to open up at one of the airfields in Berlin. So it extends about 20 miles out from the center of the city. And so you didn't need the approval of any of the occupying powers to fly in that zone. Well, fortunately for us, Steinstuecken was inside the Berlin control zone. And by 1961, the US Army had helicopters in Berlin. So one morning, the people in Steinstuecken who hadn't gone into work or hadn't gone into school, they hear helicopter blades. They look up, they see a US Army helicopter landing, and stepping out of it is a man that they instantly recognize. So the people in Steinstuecken are overjoyed. They swarm Clay. They give him flowers. They give him a tour of of their neighborhood. And while he's touring, the children and their moms are going over and looking at the helicopters. It's the first time that I'm sure that many of them had seen one. And while he was there, Clay told them, reassured them that the Americans would protect Steinstuecken. And the message that then went out to the Soviets and the East Germans is that this is the most isolated area in all of the Western occupation zones. So if the Americans say they're going to protect that, then that's a strong message they're going to protect the rest of the Western sectors as well. So a big PR boost for the Allies here. This picture is in the book. In the foreground, you see residents of Steinstuecken waving goodbye to Clay as his helicopter takes off. And it might be kind of hard to see, but in the background, you see a bunch of other people standing there. These are the Steinstueckeners' neighbors from surrounding communities, people that they had been friends with for decades. And now they're standing behind the barbed wire fence that the East Germans have set up. So again, one of these examples of a picture is sometimes worth 1,000 words. If you want to see the separation that was caused in German families and in German communities by the Cold War, this is it right here. All right. Well, Clay was no dummy. He recognized that the Soviets might be cagey enough to just wait a month or two, let the press interest from his visit die down, and then allow the exclave to be taken over by the East Germans. So Clay decided to put a U.S. Army detachment in the village, 3 to 4 military police, basically a presence patrol, a tripwire, if you will. They did not have enough armament, strong enough armament to defend the city against any kind of attack. They just had personal weapons, but they established a military police detachment in the basement of the mayor's house. And I talk about this in detail in the book. What they did was they took a communications wire and ran it up the mayor's chimney, put an antenna on top of his chimney, and used that for radio communications with Berlin Brigade headquarters. And that began an 11-year presence for the U.S. Army in the community of Steinstuecken. And what they would do is they would just fly in fresh patrols every 3 or 4 days. All right, so this is what it looked like around Steinstuecken. This is some of the earlier barriers that were put up. And this is the death strip area in between Steinstuecken in the foreground and the outskirts of Berlin in the background. These were taken by American personnel flying into Steinstuecken. So you see the cleared area there. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the death strip, and the idea behind it is designed to deter people from trying to go from East Berlin into the Steinstuecken exclave, which was technically West Berlin, from which they could be evacuated from West Berlin into West Germany. Although in the early stages of the Berlin Wall crisis, when initially Steinstuecken was just surrounded by a pretty flimsy barbed wire fence, a lot of people did break into it. And what would happen is the MPs would then take those refugees, they would dress them up in U.S. Army ponchos, they would put U.S. Army helmet liners on them and fly them out in helicopters because they knew that the East Germans were watching them fly out, so they disguised them as American soldiers. But relatively quickly, the GDR built much stronger fences around the exclave, and it quickly became a place that you couldn't escape from. All right. So then from 1961 to 1972, you had an American presence in Steinstuecken that could only be supported by aircraft. So that created some unique conditions in the community. First, they tended to get a lot of dignitaries because anyone significant coming to West Berlin generally heard about Steinstuecken, and then many of them wanted to see it. So this is General Clay visiting again. This is Mayor Willy Brandt, the mayor of Western Berlin, flown in by helicopters. And anytime the American, there was a delegation that came to visit, it was a big event for the people who lived in the village, especially the children. And so they would tag along. And so this is a not uncommon sight that you have American generals talking to senior officials and local kids just hanging around next to them like it was nothing, because in Steinstuecken it wasn't. All right, I'm going to read a section from the book. It's an interview I did with a girl who grew up in Steinstuecken, and she talked about what it was like when the helicopters arrived. The children were very fond of the helicopter landings. It was an event for them. All of the children who were too young to go to school, when we would hear the helicopters, we knew they were going to land, and we would come running from our houses to the landing zone. The helicopter pilots greeted the children warmly. Usually the air crews had some time on the ground, so the flyers often let the children climb into the helicopter's cargo bay and sit in the seats. As a thing, often the pilots would fire up the helicopter's engines, get the main rotor blades going, and generate some prop wash for the children to enjoy. The children loved feeling the prop wash, said Heike. Her name is Heike Behrendt. It was a heavy, heavy wind. The smaller children could lean into it, and the force of the prop wash held them upright. It reminded Heike Behrendt of a thrill ride at a carnival. All right. So here are some pictures from inside, just general pictures of life in Steinstuecken. Most of the residents they didn't have cars. They would either walk or bike to a West German checkpoint where they would then pick up the bus. This gentleman here on the right-hand side is an American MP. You'll notice that his name tape, which is on the right side of his uniform, is covered up. And the reason they did that is they knew that the East Germans were photographing all of the American soldiers that ever had duty in the village, and they were trying to get their names as well so they could build a roster of who's in the village. And you see one of the GDR photographers in the background here. All right. The American military built a really strong connection with the people in Steinstuecken. I have lots of good stories in the book from what Steinstuecken residents remember in their interactions with the Americans and what American soldiers remember in their interactions with the Steinstueckeners. At the very top, you see a helicopter playset in the shape of a helicopter. It was built by the Berlin Brigade and given to the children of Steinstuecken. So here you see a German official using the helicopter playset as a launching pad for candy. And then here you see the results over here. Now down at the bottom, you see children with U.S. Army soldiers in their dress uniforms. Early on, when the Americans started their detachment in Steinstuecken, they started flying in Thanksgiving dinner as a way to build a rapport with the people in the village. And for many of the Germans, that was the first time that they tasted unique American foods like sweet potatoes. And so that became a tradition that the MPs maintained. And then they decided to take it one step further and take the children of the village and bring them back to the Army barracks for Thanksgiving dinner. And for those of you that have been with the American military, especially overseas, you know that the Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners are very big deals for the military community, because we're away from home. And so it's a reminder of home. And so the soldiers get dressed up in their best uniforms. The cooks put on the best food. And so they brought the children to celebrate. And so these two pictures you see at the bottom are from the American military community newspaper showing the MPs hosting the children of Steinstuecken for Thanksgiving dinner at the Army barracks. All right. This picture on the left-hand side, I think we know who that gentleman is. Interestingly, if you were a West Berliner, you were not authorized to own or fly an aircraft during most of the Cold War. The only ones that are actually authorized to fly in the air above West Berlin were the four occupying powers. So the joke I tell is that I guess Santa and the North Pole weren't part of the four occupying powers, so the Americans had to fly Santa when he was in the American zone. Over here on the right-hand side, this orange school bus was what the residents of Steinstuecken used to get their kids to and from schools in West Berlin. Now, one of the things that I like about the story of Steinstuecken is when you think of the Cold War, you think of world events. You think of the United States versus the Soviet Union. You think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall crisis. But in this particular case, the Cold War was a very personal thing. If you lived in Steinstuecken, you dealt with the Cold War issues every day. And one of the things that the Steinstuecken residents pointed out is they did everything they could to try to make life as normal as possible and to get along with the East German border guards as much as possible. And in most cases, they succeeded. So when you're with people and you get to know them one-on-one, a lot of the political issues just tend to fall aside. And so this school bus is a good example of that. You had to be a Steinstuecken resident to come into Steinstuecken unless you got permission from the East Germans. Well, it was very hard to get. So one day, the school bus driver, her nephew lived in Berlin and he had never visited. So she decided that she was going to pick him up one day. He was high school age, and she was just going to tell the bus driver that, hey, he's one of the kids that lives in the village. He'll come in for a short visit and then he would leave. Well, the bus pulls up, the East German border guard leans in the window, and he looks right at the boy, points at him and said, "Who is that?" And the bus driver says, "Well, he lives in the village." And the border guard said, "I know all the kids in the village and he doesn't live there." So at that point, she was potentially in danger. She was on East German territory at that point, and she was breaking the rules. And so he could have arrested her. He could have, there's a bunch of things that could have gone to her. But he was a nice guy. And he said, "Okay, we have shift change in an hour and a half. Just make sure that he's out of here by then. And I wanted to tell you another story. Well, I think it's a good human interest story of how the families that lived in Steinstuecken took advantage of the American military presence. Well, some of the mothers realized that they could take advantage of their friend with their friendship with the East German border guards. Let's say, for example, they had a child who misbehaved and needed to be put on restriction, needed to be grounded, so to speak. Well, what some of the mothers would do is they would go up and they would tell the border guards, "Hey, Hans is misbehaving. He's grounded. Do not let him go into West Berlin." So then when Hans would ride up with his bicycle and ask the East German border guards to lift the pole so he could go on into West Berlin, in some case they wouldn't do it because, "No, Hans, your mother has come and talked to us and we know her and we're not raising the pole for you. You should listen to her next time." And then there's this other story that I have. Let's see here. I remember one time the Americans came to babysit when my brother was a half-year old. They came in for patrol and they were in uniform with all of their weapons. The situation was that you had a young family that needed to go into West Berlin to take care of some legal matter, maybe go to the notary or something. And they couldn't find a babysitter. So they noticed that the Americans were sometimes off duty. And so they got them to agree to babysit. So they came in from patrol. They were in uniform with all their weapons, and they put their weapons on the cupboard to make sure the children could not reach them for safety. My mother showed them in the kitchen where to warm up the milk for the baby. And then my parents left, and the MPs were babysitting there in their uniforms and helmets. If you would tell that to somebody outside of Steinstuecken, it was very strange to them to imagine that people in uniform could be used for babysitting. In our life in Steinstuecken, we came in contact with people with weapons and with uniforms every day. We found them to be nice and friendly. We knew they were there to help us for our security, and so it was not a strange feeling for us. It was very common. In 1972, as part of détente, an agreement was reached where the East German government sold a strip of land to West Berlin that was just wide enough for them to build a road. So this is the opening of that road. And with that road opening up, the West Berlin police, the US Army could get to Steinstuecken. So they took out the military police detachment, and Steinstuecken de facto became a part of West Berlin. So once the road was built, the East Germans built the Berlin Wall on both sides of it. And so this picture that you see here on the left is similar to the view that I had when in 1988, as a young Army lieutenant, I went on a tour of Steinstuecken. We were driving through West Berlin, and then we turned on this one country road, and we went down this road, and we were surrounded on both sides by the Berlin Wall with the walls, the watchtowers. We had no idea where we were going. And we got to the end, the wall opened up, and there was this little community there. And so that's how I came to know Steinstuecken. All right. I see we're running a little long here, so I'm going to go ahead and get to the last few slides. These are recent pictures of Steinstuecken. The gentleman on the right here was one of the American helicopter pilots who flew into the village. This is a memorial that was put up by the US Army and the people of Berlin to the helicopter airlift. These are Huey helicopter blades. This memorial is still there. And in the background, there's the helicopter playset. The people who live in Steinstuecken still maintain it. Their kids play on it. And inside their clubhouse, these are mementos to the American presence. All right, I have this is a list of resources here that if you want to do more studying about Steinstuecken itself or just Cold War in Berlin, I will, Katja has these slides so she can share these with you. And this brings me up to my last slide. So my book is available on Amazon. It's also available directly from the publisher, Acclaim Press. That's their contact information there. And again, Katja will have these slides here. And if you want to email me directly and have any questions for me, that's my email. And this is a good time for me to stop. So at this point, I will open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Don. Yes, please ask away. And for those who joined late, we recorded the entire session and we will make that video available to all of you. But please go ahead and ask Don your questions.
Don, this is Ron Cosmo. Great presentation and also very interesting. Um, in terms of Steinstuecken, do you think it played a role, though, in some way or form for American intelligence to just get information about East Germany?
I think so. Now, I sent an official request to the CIA, and they responded back politely, said they had no information for me. I have to think there was something that was going on. They were just too good of an opportunity for the Americans to pass up. But I found nothing in my open source research that conclusively points to that.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, well, don't confirm or deny, right?
Right. No, if I'd found something, I would have put it in the book. But if there's, I'm sure there's lots of information about Steinstucken that will be declassified as the years go on. But for right now, nothing official about American intelligence presence there.
Yeah, and also just have there been any like delegations, just out of curiosity, of like citizens or people that have lived in Steinstücken that have gone to the States? Because I mean, really, this is tantamount to America and all the good things we do and how we preserve freedom and stand up to people that try to oppress or
Mhm.
suppress freedom. So it was. Did you ever detect any such delegations or in? I know you spoke a little bit about American and German delegations coming into Steinstücken, but
Mhm.
did their citizens ever like go to the States and officially express their gratitude?
Not that I found, but they definitely did a lot to express their gratitude while they were in Berlin. So, but no, I didn't find any evidence of official delegations coming over.
Thank you.
Now, a lot of them did come over personally to visit the Grand Canyon.
Cool.
A bunch of them said they thought that was wonderful.
Thank you.
We have a question here in the chat from Mary Garnett. It says, could you comment on the Steinstücken of today?
It has been completely absorbed by the growth of Berlin, the because the area around Steinstücken had been kept undeveloped. And there, as you know, there's a huge housing shortage in West Berlin or in Berlin. And so that became prime land for development. And it's been completely surrounded by urban growth. But inside the community itself, that had already been pretty well built out. So that's still pretty much the same. The one place where they did build is the helipad. That's now got housing on it.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? You can put them either in the chat or just raise your hand or unmute yourself and start speaking at this point.
I have one last one. What motivated you to write this book?
Well, there was no English language book available on Steinstucken. There was a German language one. I'm a history major, and I'd always wanted to write a history book, and I wanted to write on a subject that hadn't been covered. And I looked around and I found that there is a very good book on the early Cold War years of Steinstucken. It's written by a gentleman named Honoré Marc Catadal Jr. His son Ray Catadal is well known by the people at the museum, but his book stopped in the late 1960s, and so I thought the subject needed a fuller treatment, and also now there's a lot more information that's declassified. Catadal wrote his book during the Cold War, so there's a lot he couldn't say. Um, and also a lot of the people in Steinstucken in the American military they were passing on. They were getting older. They wanted their stories recorded. So I was fortunate I had the opportunity to do that. So it was too good of an opportunity to pass up.
Well,
Thank
thank
you
you
for
for that,
doing this.
Don. And Don, earlier, you mentioned that you are interested in a follow-up project. Could you perhaps say a little bit about that?
Yeah, the book was mostly written by from English language sources or from translations I could get from people in Steinstuecken, but I'm sure there's a wealth of information in the West Berlin archives and the West German archives that needs to be translated and is now available. Probably there's information now in the East German former East German archives as well. So what I'd like to do is I'm hoping to get some support to get those archives researched, documents identified, translated, and then what I can do is I can write a second version of this book that tells it from the West German and the West Berlin side as well. So maybe a second version of this book, years down the road.
And we had a question in the chat asking if the book is available on Amazon. For
Yes.
all those who are curious, I just posted the link to the Amazon site in the chat. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon that says chat. If you go in there, you should be able to click on that and open it up or copy and paste it out of the chat. And yes, it is available, but it can also be bought by emailing Don directly at the email address that is displayed here on the screen. And that way you can get a signed copy, correct, Don?
Right. And the price on Amazon is $29.95. But what I'll do is for anyone who attended the presentation tonight, I was going to sell the books for $20. So I'll honor that price. And then Katya, I need to do a little research to see exactly how much media mail is. But if you send me a check that for $20 plus the media mail price, I will sign a book and put it in an envelope and send it back to you. So I'll have that information for you in a few days, Katya, and then you can tell people what the total price would be.
I will
But
be
I'll be
glad
glad
to
to do
do
that.
that.
Okay.
And in order to do that, you can also email us. I'm going to put our email address in the chat as well. It is info@gamusa.org. So please email us and let us know if you're interested in buying a signed copy of Don's book. And be sure to give us your address, and we will be glad to connect you with Don directly. And Don, you will tell us the final price. I don't
Right.
know the exact size and weight of the book. That's very important for media mail, but media mail is a good way
I'll
to
find
find
that
it.
out. I'll find that out.
Great,
And
thank
one
you.
thing I will ask though is for anybody who reads the book, if you're willing to go on Amazon and do a review, that really helps because then that bumps up the book in the search algorithm and it makes it easier to sell more copies.
That sounds wonderful. Well, do we have any other questions or comments? Ron just put in the text, thank you in the chat. Thank you, excellent story. If you have any other questions at this point, this is your chance. Do I hear something? No? Yes? Thought there was a sound somewhere. I thought I heard a voice, but I can't be sure. Was somebody trying to ask something, or did somebody have a comment? If not, I guess we will conclude the presentation at this point. Thank you so much, Don. And if there are any follow-up questions, you can always email Don directly at this
Yes,
email
please.
address here, steinpocket@gmail.com. And you can also email us, the German American Heritage Foundation and Museum, at info@gamusa.org. That address is in the chat as well. You can also get it from our website. Thank you all very, very much for being with us tonight. And thank you to Don for this very interesting presentation on a piece of little known and perhaps even forgotten Cold War history.
And thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
You are very welcome. It was a pleasure having you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.